Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, page 1328. Aleph Shin Chav Ches. Where we finished the paragraph on that page. So let me review what we learned yesterday, and maybe with a little more elaboration. And that is, this paragraph concerns itself with the comparison and describing the superiority, the advantage of the third type of sweetening, of the Gevuros, of the severities, of the judgments, of the concealments, of the darkness. Like he keeps saying, the sweetening of the bitter and the illumination of the dark. And the key point is that this I'm reading from the bottom of page 1327, that the second amtaka, the second level of sweetening, chesed gavoya. It came from a high level of chesed of atik, as we learned. That's why it has the power to transform and displace the whole darkness, not just sweeten it or neutralize it like in the first level of sweetening. And that causes the fundamental nature of the bitter to become sweet, to become fundamentally sweet, and the dark to become light. But it's all through chesed. In other words, through a force that's not the Gevura itself. I'm a force outside of it. And therefore, the way it transforms it is also, and that's the second side of it, it transforms it into light. It's not that the darkness itself. In other words, light is the dominant feature here. Giluyim. So even though it's coming from the highest levels of Gilui and revealing the highest levels of the divine, but it's still Giluyim, as he puts it. Amokar le-Gilui. Etzem ha'er. Mokar le-Mokar, as I explained in the previous classes. And the same is also true with Chesed and Gevura, as the midas of Chesed and Gevura. Like he said, also not just darkness and light, but also kindness and severity. That the way it transforms it is that the chesed comes in the place of the Gevura, like the comes in the place of the darkness. Not by engaging with it, but like he said, the king's glow of his face is such that just transcends the whole chesed and Gevura in the first place. And therefore, it completely eliminates the Gevura, like the king that forgives even someone that was guilty of sitting and sentenced to capital punishment. Forgives him simply because of the glow, not because of an engagement. The first level of sweetening is the sweetening of chesed and gevura, and they both engage, so to speak, a prosecutor and a defense. Here, the brei pnei melachayim, this higher gili, causes that the chesed replace the gevura. But in the third level of bamtokas hagvura mitzad atzmei, it's coming from within the gevura itself, not due to the chesed of an outside force that's influencing it. In Aveda terms, not that the divine soul is inspiring the animal soul, and even the animal soul has some inspiration it catches on its own, but here it's being generated from the distress, from the very darkness that we learned earlier what that is, that when it hits rock bottom, so to speak, it gets to a point where it feels the distress literally like a deathly cry. That is the ultimate tshuva that transforms the darkness into light. The zdainus to zachi is the bitter to sweet. But that's coming from within. And that's the ultimate, that's the tachlis kavon of dir b'tachtenim, as he said in the parentheses, that the tachtenim themselves, that the physical world from the bottom up is transformed, not from the top down, is transformed into being a dira, a home for God. And therefore, what kind of earth is it? That comes from cheshach itself. It's not the oid of Giluyim, it's the oid of the Helam Ha'atzmi. What does that mean? That means that the Helam Ha'atzmi, which is fundamentally beyond revelation, is revealed now. Oid b'chinas Helam Ha'atzmi mamish, that's higher than any form of Gili, because it's not coming from a revelation. It's actually coming from the opposite. It's coming from utter darkness. That's what's causing the distress of the animal soul and the avodah of it. And that's why here on that the cloud and the darkness, they themselves radiate. And then the end of the paragraph, the second half of the paragraph on page 1328, he went back that with this we can understand back what we learned on page 1315, when he began the discussion, the two key opinions of what exactly sweetened the bitter waters by the Mei Mora. So there's the opinion of the Zohar. The Zohar says it's Eitz HaChaim. That is consistent with the second way of sweetening. The Eitz HaChaim is higher than the whole concept of Gvura and Movis and death. And therefore, when you put the branch of the tree of life, Torah, Eitz Chaim, like we learned, so that power has the power, Machzira Lemutiv, like we learned earlier, to transform the bitter into sweet. But then there's the opinion of the Medrash. The Medrash says that it actually wasn't the tree of life. It was either olive or the willow or that bitter beet, or that funi or radufni. And what is that? That the bitter, that indicates on the third level of transformation, that the gvura itself, the bitterness itself, the makkah itself, like the Medrash says, the illness itself becomes the toxic. The toxin becomes the healer, the elixir, the healing agent. That's the third level of the transformation. So basically, the Zohar and the Medrash go, each one explains the sweetening of the bitter, either the second way or the third way. The Zohar is like the second ephant, and even higher is the Medrash. Regardless whether it's regardless whether it's a zayis, the olive branch, or the willow branch, or the third type of branch, but all of them are bitter. And the bitterness itself becomes transformed. Okay. And he brought what happened by Elisha, that Elisha healed and sweetened the water through salt. That's the same idea, salt. Not through a higher chesed, through a bitterness, something that's Gvura itself healed. And then finally brought the story of Yeshaya and Cheskiyahu, how he healed them with a cake of figs. Which is also, like Rashi says, a nes b'tech nes, not just that he healed them, but that he healed them with something that was the opposite of healing itself. I didn't really look into that specifically, whether it's the way Rav Shlomo explained yesterday, that's the moisture, or some other way of explaining what te'ena is. But regardless, that is also the idea of Hamtokas HaGvura from within the Gvura itself. So the Gvura itself is causing the healing. He didn't bring the Tanya in Perek Zayin at the end of chapter 7, which I'm actually teaching now on the Tanya class on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, where there he says that the reason that Tshuva Ma'ava, Tshuva from love, transforms Danis to Zochis, which we brought earlier here, transforms deliberate sins into Zochis, into merits, he says because through this Danis, it caused a tremendous thirst, similar to the distress call that we're learning here, a tremendous thirst. And since Hoyel Val Yodam came this tremendous love for God, that's why this Danis become transformed, which that is consistent with this third method of transformation, which is tshuva. Later we will learn about tshuva more, but we already learned it in the previous page. The deep tshuva that comes from the depths of the heart, that's deeper than the cry of the nefesh alikis of a tzaddik, deeper than ava b'tainugim of a tzaddik. But that would also seem to mean that it comes from the darkness itself. So that's a whole different type of transformation, that the Gvura itself, the Choshech itself, is the catalyst for transformation here. Okay. The parentheses, which I'll just review briefly, the Rashab goes back also to page 13. What page was that? 13, where he began, not 13, 15. But I mentioned it yesterday, where he discussed on page 1319. So in discussing transformation of Gvura to Chesed, or sweetening, was one of the other examples brought was when Moshe Rabbeinu drew water out of the rock. So rock is Gvura. That's clear. Tzur. And when he came from the, but he's like he said, the Hafchei Tzur, Agam Mayim, transforming the stone. So Tzur is Gvura. And there he explained that what drove the Gvura out, what sweetened the Gvura, in other words, what caused the stone Gvura to give Mayim, which is Chesed. So he said clearly that came from Chesed, not coming from the Gvura itself. like he said, it came either from the levels of Adin, Melifnei Adin Chulei Haaretz, or like he says afterwards, it came through the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu either struck the stone or he spoke to it. So the first time Hashem told him to strike the stone. The second time he told him to speak to it. And the Razal, this is a Yalkut, and Parsha Chukah says, Shana Lov Perek Echad. It says, so to speak to it a chapter like in Torah, and that will cause it to give out water. So either way, it's coming from a force. That's not the stone itself. It's not that the stone feels the stoniness of Gvura that caused this to transform to water. It came from a force, like he says clearly. The words there were, so it's clearly coming from another force. And the Torah. So it's either through striking the stone or speaking Torah to the stone. So there, it's clearly referring to the second level of sweetening, which is coming from Chesed. It's transforming the stone to water, but not from the Gvura itself, not from the stone itself. But yes, the stone is giving off water, but the what causes it to do so is Moshe striking or hitting the stone. In the parentheses here, the Rebbe Rashab digs a little deeper and says that too can be explained in two ways. And he says like this. I'm just reviewing what we learned yesterday. That lefi zeh yeshlemer, lefi what? Lefi what we just learned. That the Gvura itself is the catalyst for the transformation. You could say that that's the difference between striking the stone or speaking to it. That when he struck the stone, then it's not he's so-called inspiring or influencing the stone with his chsadim that it should give water. He's striking it. That's Gvura. Like we learned before about Bitush, with the Nefesh Habamis, that Nefesh Habamis feels broken. It feels afflicted. So the striking of the stone, he says, that would be Hamtokas Agvurim Mitzadatzma. And when it says V'debartem el asela, that he should speak to it, Torah, he should read, he should speak to the stone Torah, he says, Hu Hamtokas Alidei Chesed. So first of all, he's speaking Torah, and Torah is Chesed. Like we learned before, that Torah is the power, like of Chesed, that the power of the Machzira Lemutav, the power of Torah. So that's Chesed. Okay. So with this, basically he's saying that what I said earlier on page 1319 was in general. But when you break it down, the striking the stone would be like coming from Gvura itself, transformation of the stone itself, and speaking is through Chesed. But then the Rebbe Rashab brings from the Yalkut that I mentioned, that even the speaking to the stone is also considered a form of Gvura. But he says that's not how we're learning it here in this Maimer. So he brings the Yalkut says that the Yalkut says the following. What is the difference? Why did the first time God tell him to strike the stone and the second time to speak to it? So it's because it's the process of education. Striking is when a child is still untamed and untrained, you have to be more disciplinarian. So we're not talking about, even though there is the concept of striking a child, Shevet Musa B'nai, but like he says, once the child grows, once the person has been trained in, like let's say a soldier in the army, the early training is very harsh because you have to break the habits of the person. So they have to climb up wet mountains and with heavy weight. It's far more strenuous and far more exertion in the beginning. But once you've already so-called tamed the stone, now Hashem says to him, this time speak to it. Kiven shehigdil b'dibur miyas. And now speak to it, not striking it. In other words, a milder form, but it's still miyasre. You still rebuke it. You're still disciplining it, but you're doing it now with words, not with striking it, like Moshe Rabbeinu did. And the Rebbe Rashab says that elsewhere it explains that the speaking was not chesed. That's Musar Avicho, that's the rebuke of the father that comes from Gvura of Atik. So if that's the case, so even the speaking is also coming from Gvura. Unlike what he said in the beginning of the parentheses. So he says, even the speaking, not just the striking. So the Rebbe Rashab says, but calls Eloi commotion is bar le'il. But all this is not like we discussed earlier back on page 1319. First of all, there, both ways, both speaking and striking was coming from chesed. Even according to what he says here, that the striking is chesed, is gvura, and the speaking is chesed, but according to the Medrash, even the speaking is gvura. So he says it's not like we're discussing it here. And then he brings finally that gvura of atik is in general a whole different level of gvura that's higher than berurim altogether. And I suggested yesterday that the reason he brings that is not to reconcile, even though you could say it's coming to reconcile a bit, but I believe he brings that because you could have like gvura as in rebuke. That's not gvura of atik. That's the gvura within that. So that is, but gvura of atik is l'mayla b'chinas berurim, higher than any form of refinement or so on. So it could be that the gvura of atik that he says musar avicha is a higher level of gvura than it's a gvura that's more like chesed actually than the gvura within gvura itself. Now, why he brings it again, I'm not 100% clear, but as I said, I suggested that perhaps what he's trying to say is that even according to the striking of the stone is the gvura from itself, like the gvura in the sheirish of atik. I think that's what he's trying to say. That's the gvura coming from itself. In other words, according to the explanation, that is the gvura is being transformed, not chesed transforming gvura, that the gvura. But it could also be a reconciliation between the two explanations, because if it's coming from gvura of atik, then it's more like form of chesed. Maybe not. No, I don't think that's the word. I'm not sure exactly what he's saying with this, to be honest. Okay, I'll get back with this. I have to study it a bit more to try to figure out exactly what he's saying here. So with this, we sum up, we concluded the paragraph. So I'm ready to continue on, unless someone has that question. Musar avicha is the gvura in Beichus Timah. That's avicha. The stone. Okay, so he continues now. Omnom, now comes the question. Omnom adayin sarich lav. However, we still need to understand something. Isn't it the case that also this third level of sweetening the gvura, that the gvura, the severities and the judgments and the darkness are transformed from within themselves on their own, not through chesed, to goodness, to sweetness, to goodness and to light. We have to say that also comes through an elyon dafke. It doesn't just happen out of the blue. It's also happening due to a higher revelation. As we learned earlier, so at the bottom of page 1326 and top of 1327, so he brought the sounding of the great shofar. That will be, so he says, when we talked about the Evdim Be'eretz Asher, those that are completely lost in the material indulgences of this world, Eretz Asher, the Tainugim of Taivas of Elam Hazeh, She'en Lam Shum Gilei Eir Klal, they're completely lost and they have no revelation. They got, like he said, like a lost sheep that lost its way. Vurak, and the only way that it goes is Huraksha Hara Yisir Ma'atzmai. So the only way it returns is because the Ra itself, it feels its distress and its dark and the abyss, the darkness where it's wandered off. So that's the essence. And nevertheless, it's not just coming out of nowhere. It's the Shefer Gadol that reaches even that lost soul. Habam Maila, and the Shefer Gadol is coming from above. It's not a Shefer being blown by the person. It's the sound of the great Shefer, Shefer Gadol from above. So when you say that's coming from Gvura Mitzvah Atzmi, it also, the catalyst for it is a gili from a higher place. So how are we saying that it's coming from within? And ultimately, how is it distinguished from if it's from coming from Chesed or coming from Shefer Gadol? Both of them, it's not the Gvura itself. Both of them is a force outside that's stimulating and awakening and transforming the Gvura. And the same thing with the other point that he made. Remember with Yom Kippur, he said, B'chein, B'kal Shebekalim, that even a person who's a Kal Shebekalim, meaning he's completely lenient, the lenient of the lenient, in observance of Yiddishkeit, mitzvah, Torah, and mitzvahs, Hameseirin b'tshuva b'Yom Kippur b'ne'ilah, and they get stimulated and awakened. B'tshuva on Yom Kippur during the Ilah. This he said at the bottom of page as well, on bottom of page 1326. We said clearly that you see, so that too, how does it gam kenal yedei ha'ara? That's also coming through the Shefer Gadol, which he said the Yom Kippur radiates a taste or a similarity or something, a semblance of the great Shefer. You said that on page 1327. So it also comes through Yom Kippur, through the Gilui of Yom Kippur, that awakens that soul. So that's the case. And the same thing with Meimora. When they spoke about the opinion of the Medrash, that the bitter waters are sweetened through the bitterness itself, through bitter branch, through the bitter branches, the different opinions with the branches, but not through Eitz HaChaim, through the bitter branch, also by Harim Makom Mokim, Heiro Hashem Eitz Vayashlech Alamai. The water didn't just suddenly become sweet on its own accord. God had to show Moshe Rabbeinu the branch. And the branch had to be thrust into the water. The waters didn't get sweetened completely on their own. In other words, even in the third form of sweetening, we see they all happen through some type of other catalyst. So how do we say that it's really on its own? And essentially, how do you distinguish it from the second level of sweetening, which is coming also from a force outside of the Gevurah? So that's the question that Rabbi Rashab asks. Like you said, we still need to understand this point. And now he answers the question and says, ha'inyan hu, the inyan in this is, and as I explained a number of times, the way Chassidus asks and answers a question doesn't say v'yesh leimer or hatirutz. Ha'inyan, it gives us a whole context to understand the whole subject matter. So he says, what's the inyan? The vade kain, it's certainly the case. That's not a question. It's certainly that it doesn't happen alone on its own completely. That's something that they say is the awakening or the stimulation or the arousal comes from a higher power that comes milmaila. However, in the case of the third form of sweetening, in contrast to the second, this koyach, however, in the third form of sweetening, it's not coming from chesed and gilui, it's coming from the root of gvura. So it's true, the gvura on its own is like a lost soul, or kal shebekalim, is in a very dark place. But what is ultimately stimulating it is not an outside force called chesed and gilui, it's the root of gvura itself. I'll explain in a moment. Let's just read inside, then I'll explain. That's the inyan that the gvuras nimtokin b'sharsha. Remember the expression that he began with when he first started this whole subject matter was eina gvuras nimtokin ela b'sharsha. In other words, the ultimate sweetening of gvura is not through chesed, because that's not the root of gvura. Chesed is a different track. Sweet water and bitter water are not the same category. So the chesed, the sweet, is sweetening the bitter. But the real transformation, the words he used was that Ikaram Toka Amitis, I'm reading from page 1325, is only Bisharshana Atzmi, from the Helama Atzmi of Gvura. So what he's explaining now is, yes, it's true that it's not coming from the dark that state it's coming from a higher power, but the higher power is the root of Gvura. Is the very Gvura is rooted in a place that gives it the power to transform more from within itself. So even though it's coming from a higher force, but the higher force is the actual root of Gvura, not Chesed, not Gili, not a different entity. So it's like saying that in the depths of the abyss of the Kal Shebekalim, or the lost soul, lies is Gvura, because it's all concealed, but that darkness is rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi of Elokus, and that Helam Ha'atzmi, that root, is what gives it the power to transform from within itself, because it's still Gvura. Gvura is not changing its personality, it's only changing from a dark place to a divine place. So in other words, the darkness of existence is rooted in the concealment of the divine. That's its actual root. Chesed and Gilui is not the root of Helam, it's the root of Giluyim. Any revealed blessing, any revealed sweetness in our lives comes from Chesed. Where does darkness come from? Where does anxiety come from? Where does grief come from? Where does darkness come from? Every state of darkness comes from somewhere. It's rooted ultimately, as we learned earlier, the Helam Ha'atzmi of the Eibishter. So when that Helam Ha'atzmi is always active, even though it's completely concealed, as we're going to learn in a moment, that is what's giving the power for Gvura, even when it hits the rock bottom, to transform itself. And then it's a transformation from within Gvura, because it's coming from the root of Gvura, not Chesed. The whole subject, as I said, where you first mentioned Eina Gvuras Nimtoken El B'Sharsham, is I just want to point out the page where it began. The whole subject matter was quite a while back. Yeah, here we are. On page 1307. That's the first time he mentioned it, just for the record. Now, it continues. And this is the inyan that the Gvuras are sweetened in their root. He explains now what that means. That means with the power of their root and their source. Now, if you think about it, this goes back to what I said. I had said earlier that maybe a suggested idea when I spoke about hypothermia, and I spoke about that when a person hits rock bottom, so usually we see it, they're desperate. You come to a point, there's nowhere that you can go lower, so the only place is to go higher. The person their lives become so out of control, and so out of, it's impossible that there's that alone awakens them. But a Chassidus, according to this, it's much deeper than that. The very possibility that a person could reach such a low level doesn't come from nowhere. It's true, it's a very dark place to be, but ultimately it's rooted in Helam, in the Koyach HaHelam of Elokus. If God did not conceal his presence, and if God did not have a power of Koyach HaHelam Ha'atzmi, in existence could never have been any type of Helam. Not a Helam, even a good one. Even like the Tzimtzum, which on its own is in order to bring Gilui, that's only possible because God has the power to conceal himself. Like the father that conceals himself from his child. If there was no concealment in the root, there'd be no concealment, there would be no Holocaust, basically. There wouldn't be the possibility of a soul getting lost and all the darkness that we've been describing. So the mere fact that we can come to a place like that is because it's rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi. The thing is that when you get into the place of true darkness, it's completely opposite of Elokus. You can't say, God forbid, that the Holocaust or any tremendous darkness is godly. You could say it's rooted in the godly power to conceal. But now, because it's a godly power to conceal, that's what you want to reveal. You want to reveal that this too is coming from a godly place. And that godly place, that's what the Gvura gets transformed. Al Yedei b'koyach sharshan ha'makayram. So that very root and source of Gvura, of the darkest form of darkest situation, ultimately gives the power for us to get out of even the lowest, the darkest abyss in our lives. Well, no one should know of such darkness. But even the Oivdim Be'eretz Asher, the Kal Shebekalim. So what happens on Yom Kippur is a Gili of Sheresh Ha'atzmi, of the Helam Ha'atzmi. That's why even a Kal Shebekalim gets awakened. Because what's happening is, what allowed them in the first place to get lost to that extent, or the Evdim Be'eretz Asher, the Shefer Gadol, is not a Gili of Chesed, is the Helam Ha'atzmi that's reaching, so to speak, and stimulating its product, which is the Gvura that it created, the Gvura of the ultimate darkness of the lost souls in Asher, giving it the power to return and reconnect. But it's not coming from a Gili, it's coming from the Helam Ha'atzmi. So now he's also going to, but he didn't finish. So he says, okay, so come. Now he's going to explain one final point. The key, which is maybe the main punchline. So why is it called Mitzaratzme? If we're saying it's coming from the Shadish, it's true. We understand now it's not Chesed. It's not Gili. So it's a much higher power. Chesed and Gili is very high, but it's still Giluyim, the revelations of the divine. It's like someone being awakened through a kindness, through grace. Like the king's face, for example. The glow of the king's face, and the king forgives the sins, and the person gets transformed. But that's coming from a beautiful place. Here it's coming from the root of Gevura, which is concealment. So why do we say Mitzad Atzma? You could say it's not from Chesed, it's from the very root of Gevura, but it's really coming from the root of Gvura, not coming from the Gvura itself. So he's going to explain, no. Because it's a Helam Ha'atzmi, so even though it is the root of Gvura, so fundamentally it's in a state of concealment. So the fact that it's happening, you can call Mitzad Atzmi, like he's going to say the following. Yadua, the Shadish HaGvura, the root of Gvura, Ubchinas Helam. Like I explained now at length. The root of Gvura is from concealment. And it doesn't come in a revealed form. It comes in a concealed. It's like a koyach nelam. So just to give an example, when you see a person is, let's say, a teacher, a chacham, a talmid chacham, a scholar is teaching. So there's two things happening when if you think about it. He's teaching and revealing ideas. That's giluyim. But let's say if you're a wise student, you also see that the teacher exercises restraint. He doesn't say everything. There's some things he keeps himself, some things he wants the students to figure out, some things are not yet ready for them. Is that a power of the teacher as well? Of course it is. But it's a power that doesn't come through expression, it comes through non-expression. As a matter of fact, restraint can take even more strength and energy and exertion of the teacher than speaking. It's like the putting on the brakes. Like when you say Megala Tefach, Mechaset Fachayim. He reveals one measure and conceals two. So in other words, the koyach HaGvura is also a koyach, but it's a koyach nelam. Chesed is expressed through expression. The teacher's bestowing his chesed, he's teaching and giving. Restraint is also a power, but it's a power that expresses itself by non-expression, by restraint, by withholding, by concealment. So firstly, Gvura is rooted in Helam, and which Helam ultimately the power of God to conceal, and the way it's expressed is through restraint, through discipline, and through refraining, not through expression. And therefore, Hayisedus, the awakening and the stimulation that comes from there, and the transformation of the bitter to sweet, and darkness to light, the Gvura to Chesed, even though it's coming from a higher power, the power of the root of the Gvura itself, that is really a state with the darkness, and the Gvura are awakened and transformed on their own, because this higher power is being expressed through in a concealed way. If it was expressed in a revealed way, so that revelation is a force that you would say is causing it to be this way, but it's coming in a concealed way. We don't see it. It's working behind the scenes. It's like I said before, when a person is in the darkest place and they're awakened on Yom Kippur or through the Shefer Gadol or the bitter branch, what's happening is, yes, it's technically speaking, it's coming from the higher power, but it's not coming in a revealed way. So therefore, it's coming from within the Gevura itself, because there's nothing happening. If, for example, on Yom Kippur, you'd say that a tzaddik, a rebbe, or somebody goes over to a kalsha b'kalim who came to shul and speaks to him kindly and awakens him and stimulates him and brings out the best in him. That's a koyach golei. But if he just walks into a shul on Yom Kippur, or that he doesn't say even a shul, just Yom Kippur, or he's lost completely like a lost sheep, and suddenly you see he's woken up because he feels the distress. Where's that coming from? So it's coming from a koyach elyon, but it's coming in a concealed manner because nothing happened. All that's happening is he feels that he can't go on like this. Like we said, he feels a deathly cry. He's ready. He can't live on. He can't go on living this way. Like we said, the desperation that he feels. So technically, or essentially, it's coming, I don't want to say technically. Essentially, it's coming from the root of Gvura, which is the Helam Ha'atzmi. But the way it's expressed is through concealment, not through revelation. To just give an example back to the teacher, let's say the student recognizes that the teacher is restraining himself and not giving everything. And the student comes to the teacher and says, I want to know what you're not saying. Now, where did that come from? The teacher didn't tell him anything. He just senses that there's something going on. There's a power in what the teacher is not saying, and he wants to know it. So is it coming from himself, or is it coming from the teacher? So essentially, it's coming from the restraint of the teacher. But it's not coming in a way where the teacher says something and the student says, I want to understand what you're saying. It's coming from a sense that there's some deeper power, but that deeper power is in a concealed state. So I think there's 2 points here that are key to be made. Now, one is that Gvura is rooted in Helam, and its very way of manifesting the root is also Helam. And that's why you could say it's coming from within. Because first of all, the Gvura is rooted there. So it's really the essence of the Gvura. But also, it's not coming in a revealed way. So at the end of the day, it's the darkness itself that sensed its source, not in any revealed way. It sensed it actually through distance, not through closeness. And that's coming from the power of the Shadish, but the power of the Shadish comes in a concealed way. That's why you can call it, like he says, Nepech Ma'atzmam, okay, that's how he explains this idea. This is quite a profound piece, especially psychologically, if you think about it, because it not only gives a person hope, even in the darkest moment, it tells you that the very darkness is really rooted in a very high place. That's not justifying, by the way, suffering. It's just rooted in a very high place. And that when there is going to be the awakening, it's going to be on the deepest level because it's coming from within the distress. Like we say, the only way out is through. It's not coming because somebody is giving you, let's say a person's in pain or grief or been traumatized, and someone's coming and giving them a candy or making their lives sweet because you're distracting them or you're giving them something that's a beautiful blessing or a gift. But within their very darkness, there comes something that you can't even call revelation, even though it is ultimately going to transform the darkness to light, but it's coming from only one place it can come from, the very source and root of the darkness itself. And that is ultimately this third level of transformation. So once you think about it, you see, wow, this is like a whole nother, another reality. There's a lot more to say on it, but I'm going to stop here if anybody wants to ask any questions, and I'm sure we'll go over it more than once, a few times until we really can internalize it. I suggest reading it more than once. It's very hard to just grasp the first time because it's a very profound concept of something. Is it coming from within or is it coming from without? But when you contrast it to the second level of the second form of sweetening, it becomes easier to understand the distinction. But you could also understand why there's no way the Rebbe Rashab could have began with this third without first explaining the first and the second. But let me stop here if anybody wants to ask anything.
I think that the example that you brought from a teacher that is hiding is not very exact because this is also some form of a gilui. The Helam Ha'atzmi is not having even this. It's completely sealed.
So be it. Every example is not going to be perfect, but it's still an example of two forms of expression, two forms of powers of the teacher, the power to reveal and the power to restrain. That's all I wanted to explain. There's no example, especially my examples are not going to be exact. It's an example at the end of the day. It's coming to explain that it's also a koyach. That's the point I wanted to say, that it's a power. Not to be deceived. It shouldn't be it shouldn't confuse us to think it's nothing is happening. Restraint comes from a powerful place. So yes, the Helam Atzmi is ultimately God, like I explained, is completely beyond any form of revelation. Yeah.
Rabbi Jacobson, the
1 second. I'll just say one more thing. Tu B'Shvat Lametes, when the Rebbe was that one of those powerful sikhs where the Rebbe was crying uncontrollably, and he brought the example of the Magid, that the father hides from his child, and then he hides so well the child can't find him, so he stops looking. He says, Sunday, Sonntag gesucht, Montag gesucht, Dienstag gesucht. He says, was is the kind schuldig? Why is the child responsible? Why is the child to blame? The father hid himself so well. What's the point? The concealment was in order to bring out the ingenuity and the creativity of the child to find the father. That's the whole point of the concealment. So it's coming from a very good intention. But the concealment itself, especially a divine one, is a very powerful concealment, to the point that we can give up looking, but never think that the concealment does not have a divine element in it. The problem is when we misunderstand it. When we misunderstand concealment and we start going off on our own, that's when we can make big mistakes. And because we say, you know what, maybe God isn't here. Like we said, Im yesha elikim what's the lashon there? Im oyin. Im yesha elikim bekibenu im oyin. They were wondering, is God with us? That's what happens when we feel very dark. We can feel forsaken and feel isolated and feel that God's not with us, when in truth, the concealment is God's concealment. But we have to not misunderstand the concealment. We have to understand it as a purpose is to reveal. But the concealment can become such a power. And when you're in that state, never think that there isn't a divine force within it. I just wanted to drive that point home. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I still don't understand, Rabbi Jacobson, how this person that's rock bottom, I can understand it's coming from Koach Helam, but it still seems like you have to have a shofar gadol, as you brought the question in the beginning of this year. There's still, you're throwing the eights into the water. There still seems to be that you need some type of lamplighter. I mean, after all, Chabad Shluchim.
He made it very clear. It's not a lamplighter. It's darkness. It's the root of darkness itself. The shofar gadol is not light, and the branch is not light, and Yom Kippur is not light. It's the root. He says clearly that this is the root of darkness. Light is a different type of experience. There is a way of sweetening something through light. Here he wants to say it's because what brought the person who's in this distress? Nothing happened. It's not like he suddenly, like I said, somebody came to him and showed him that he's blessed, or he suddenly saw the light, or he had some epiphany. The very darkness, he came to a point where he feels such despair, that alone awakens him. So the question is, where's that coming from? So,
right.
So he's actually explaining that it's not gilui, it's not light. It's coming from the root of darkness, which is a koyach nelam. Listen, I said that it's going to require quite a few times reviewing it to really get it. But that's exactly what he said here.
Right, but I'm just questioning because in reality, we see how few people actually walk into a shul on Yom Kippur on their own, just from an arousal from themselves that they've hit rock bottom. Oh, I'm going to go to a Chabad house. I need Chabad. It comes from our experience, at least what I see. It comes from reaching out and helping therapy to the suicidal person. It's coming from an outside source.
Were you here when I gave the long discussion on hypothermia, psychological hypothermia?
Yes, I did hear. I've been listening later.
So I'll tell you this. What you're describing is one scenario. There's another. I have seen it with my own eyes. It's not correct what you're saying. I told the story with David Carr.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
That did not come from any Chassidus. That came from just realizing he almost killed his children. So there's no Chassidus there at all. Nothing happened. It was just, in other words, there's something that happens when you hit rock bottom. We're not talking about when somebody stimulates you. We're talking about a place where the darkness itself, like the toxic itself, can become a motivation. Rabbi Elazar ben Dedaya, why did he suddenly do tshuva at the end of his life? Nothing happened. It doesn't say something happened. He just realized that he hit the worst possible place. It was just an awareness. that is an awareness that comes from the Sheirush HaGvura. That's what he's explaining. There is what you're describing. We're a friend, and I just want to point out, the awakening on Yom Kippur doesn't mean you go to a Chabad house or a shul. It could just be an existential awakening. There are people, I know people who live their lives very materialistic, and they didn't even hit rock bottom. They just came, they didn't go anywhere. Just one morning you wake up and you start crying. An existential loneliness. A certain something happens, and it's not because something happened in your life. It's not like someone did a favor for you or gave you another chance. It's not the king forgiving you, like he says in type 2. It's not like you had someone gave you a second chance. Something happens that you just become aware within your darkness that this is a horrible place to be. I mean, if you want examples of it, I've seen this, yes. I've seen people not through any Yiserus come to that. Now, is that a Yiserus? Yes, that's called a Yiserus from the Sheirush HaGvura. It's coming from a very concealed place, but it happens. Some people call that rock bottom.
Rabbi Jacobson, the example of the Elazar ben Nodari that you brought, I understand the actual, like what happened from the Gevura, and it was all within himself. But also the story says that he was about to do his act, and it was about the discussion happening in the heavenly realms that they say, let's give this guy one more chance. And then they make the prostitute say, if you do this now, there will be no going back. So there is a trigger, they're not triggered, but there's something from above that's given to you. True that Elazar ben Dordaya, came from the Gevura place within himself, and it wasn't light and it was within himself. But it was the fact that they gave that opportunity to him, from Lamala. It wasn't just nothing happened and then he just came to it.
That's a good point.
Well, here he said also, Yom Kippur happens, Shefer Gadol happens, the bitter branch happens. There is happening. The question is, what is happening? Is it a gilui? That's why, listen, I repeat again what I said. You're not going to get it the first time. I can assure you that. This takes a lot of thinking. Read it again and again and understand. Compare it to the second. Is it like chesed? What you're saying that happened to Rabbi Elazar ben Dai is like a chesed that came to him?
No, I'm just saying that.
So I'm saying we said here also. We said here also. There's a Shefer Gadol is sounded. There's a Yom Kippur comes. There's a branch being thrown into the water. There's also something happening. The question is, what is happening? So what he's saying, what's happening is a concealed force at work, and is the root of the Gvura. It's not coming from a gili. It's coming from a place of Helam. That's what he said. We all understand that something is happening. The question is, what is happening? That's the key thing that distinguishes the third type from the second type. The whole point here is that he says clearly, Vadai. He says the word Vadai shekain sheyiseirus al yedei koyach elyon. So explain. He can't be contradicting himself. He says it comes from a koyach elyon haba milmayla. Ach shakoyach hazel b'chinas sheirush hagvura, and that's gvura sheishu because it comes in the form of a koyach nelam. So that's what needs explanation. I mean, I tried to explain it, but those few lines, the Rebbe Rashab is saying clearly it comes from a koyach elyon. That's not a chiddush. That's the whole point of the question. But he's saying that koyach elyon, however, is a koyach nelam, not a koyach gili. Even with Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya, let me ask you this: all his life, he was doing all these things. Suddenly, he was told there's the last chance. That's enough. I mean, a person who sinned his whole life. You think he didn't know that he had to? It's just there's something in darkness when you become aware that is rooted in the Sheirush HaGvura, not in Chesed. That doesn't mean the catalyst doesn't come from something. But what's happening here is you're awakening, you're stimulating the power of the divine power within Cheshech, not the divine power within Gilu. That's the key thing to keep in mind. That's what he's saying. But I do think this needs explanation, and you need to go over it again and again. I'm not suggesting that it can be understood the first time. I mean, I'll try to explain it from different angles. But I definitely think if you apply yourself, this is what he's talking about. As I said, it's a deep piece. I do think that you could find a case study of someone who gets Nisayra through Gilui. Like, let's say you hear stories, people on college campuses or other places, and they meet someone, and that person talks to them. Like Rabbi Akiva met the daughter of Kalba Sabua, and she spoke to him, and she awakened him. It didn't just come from his darkest place. He happened to be in a place where he was receptive, but the fact of the matter is someone was mashpia. You have that all the time. It could be a therapist, it could be a mashpia, it could be a teacher, it could be an experience. How many people have felt they went to Israel and they felt an experience, they felt a gilui. But what about someone who doesn't have any of the giluim and still has something that comes seemingly from within himself? We know it's coming from the Sheirish Agvura, from the Shofar Gadol, but it's seeming from within himself. There's that as well. Maybe less common, but I know that it exists because I've met people like that.
I think that basically we could
Psychologically, 1 second, psychologically, I will tell you this. I mean, I don't want to bring harsh examples because it's painful, but the Stockholm syndrome, where people who are abused by somebody else, let's say a husband abusing a wife, God forbid, or a parent, a child, or something like that, they have a tendency, unfortunately, maybe because the known evil is better than the unknown evil, that they won't just walk away, even though they're being hurt. Either they think they're completely worthless, but then there's a point where something awakens them. And it's not necessarily a gilui. It's not like somebody tells them, your husband's a monster, or this person is just hurt, because that they don't listen to. Whatever reason, distortions, they're not well, they don't have confidence in themselves, they feel they're going to be punished, whatever it may be. But there are times where there's something happens, I've seen it, where either let's say in the case of an abusive man, his husband and father, and he threatens a child. So there suddenly what happens is the mother realizes that this is a darkness that cannot be tolerated anymore. So it's not coming because she saw the light. She just sees the darkness in a way that she didn't see before. The question is why? So you could say it's desperation. I'm referring to a specific story, to be honest. I'll share it with you simply because it may explain this a bit. Where a man was abusing his wife. He would hit her physically, besides obviously emotionally and psychologically. The children he would leave alone. But one day he got so drunk or whatever happened, and he took one of the children and he literally, from the 3rd floor, he held the child out the window. And that's what hit the mother suddenly. And she realized. Now, it wasn't herself, it was her child. So you could say it's a gift from God that it happened, but it came from total darkness. It didn't come from any Giluyim exactly. It didn't come because somebody said to her, what are you doing with your life? Your husband's a dangerous person. It came from seeing how dark darkness can be. So psychologists would say that came because she really saw, up to that point, she was ready to forego and ignore her own pain, but not her child's. That's a mother's love of a child. I would suggest that in Ayin Beis, he's saying something deeper, that in the deepest cheshach, God is always there. And some way, even when it's as dark can get, you can find, I don't want to call it light, because it's not light, but something happens. So it's coming from a higher power, we know that. But the higher power is coming in the form of concealment, not in the form of revelation. Besides the fact that it's also not revealed to the person. It's not like you see someone stretching out a hand to you, you're drowning and they're stretching out a hand. That would be a gilui. But suddenly, let's say you get new koiches, you're drowning and you suddenly feel unbelievable surge of energy. So yes, it's also coming from a deeper place, but it's not coming from a revealed salvation, so to speak. It's coming from the concealment within itself. This is just some more explanations and language. I'm sure there's more, and I'm sure you can come up with some examples yourself. I'm just trying to explain what the Rebbe Rashab is saying. I mean, he is saying this. We know what he's saying. The question is, what's the explanation of it? Go ahead. You want to say something else?
That mainly this is a major difference between if it's coming from Koyach Elam or Rav Chesed. If it's a very big Gilui oil, it's not touching your core. You are getting overwhelmed, but you are not being changed. You are being changed, but not your core. If it's coming from Elam, it's touching you. The source is the Koyach Elam, but it's touching your core.
Well, that's the first point. That is the Sheirish Agvura Atzmei. It's not, That's correct. That's why it's ultimately the deepest form of transformation. At the end of the day, he said above that dir b'tachtenim means it comes from the tachtenim themselves. The Rebbe spoke a few times. He said the only reason you can explain, he says, Golos doesn't make any sense. The only thing the Eibishter wants us to cry with an emes. Even Gimel Tammuz, we explain in some ways. I explain it at least that way. When the Rebbe said, Chav Ches Nissen, I did everything I can, do what you can, basically saying, and now something has to come from you that I cannot give you with a gili. It has to come from within you. Is that coming from the power of the Rebbe too? Yes, but it has to work through you. And it has to be something that we initiate. So of course, everything comes from above. But what's the difference between you initiating and when above gives you the power, whether it's revealed or not? And if it's coming from you're initiating it, even if it's coming from a deeper force within you, you get the credit. It's really the essence of who you are, which is much deeper than just. It's like the difference in Tanya between Ava Musuteris, that is coming from the essential love of a Jew to God, is in contrast to Moyach Shalat Alalev, that your mind tells you that you should listen to God, that the divine soul should control the animal soul. And then there's when the person himself comes to it. In this case, we're talking about the animal soul itself comes to it. Anyway, much more to say on the topic, and I'm sure we'll go over it again and again until we get it as best as we can. And for the record, the Rebbe Rashab is not finished. He's going to say much more about this topic, but I think the main point he made, but he's going to explain it further as we go along. I think after we finish a few more pages, it's going to become even clearer than it is right now. I'll do my best to explain.
You have to say that there is a koyach nelom, because if not that, if a person would hit the rock bottom, he would not come to a conclusion that he have to go back to Hashem. He would become desperate, messiahish.
Okay, yeah.
So it seems like we're looking at what's the trigger. What's the trigger here? Is the trigger coming externally or from internally, from a feeling of loss, or that here I've a person who's maybe not suicidal or whatever. But my question to you, Rabbi Jacobson, it says in Torah that a person is unable to free himself from a jail. What's the lashon? There's a lashon. You can't. Okay, so then how does this correspond to that?
It's coming from the Shefer Gadol, from the branch, from Yom Kippur. That he made it clear. It's coming from a Koyach Elyon. However, it's in a concealed way. The Gevura, the darkness of your life, of this lost soul, the darkness of this lost soul is rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi of Elikus. So it's coming from the Helam Ha'atzmi that is embedded within the darkness. He says clearly it's coming from a Koyach Elyon.
Self, and that I've on Israel.
We're going in circles here. As I said to you, I think you have to read it slowly, listen to it again. But he says both things. That it's coming. He says Vadai. Did you see the word Vadai?
From a
so that clearly tells you how Ein Chavish Matris, it's not coming from. Yeah.
Still, ultimately, I think it's saying that it's still coming from within himself. This Koach Elyon.
So he explains why. He says both things together because that Koach Elyon is behelim, is completely concealed. You don't see it, even though it's working behind the scenes to allow a person to hit that rock bottom and react and wake up, basically.
But isn't when it says that in the Gemara that a person's not able to bring himself out of jail, wouldn't it? That's applying, I think, isn't it on a physical thing that is still you need somebody else to help you?
That's method number 2. This is method number 3. There is the method number 2 with somebody else, a mashpia or a revelation, but that we're talking now number 3. We're not talking about that method.
Right.
That's
number
correct.
3. So number 3 does not apply to this statement in Gemara.
No, it does apply because that's also Koyach Elyon. He
But
says
it's still
Koyach
within.
Elyon habam l'mayla. That
Right,
means
but
it's coming from, so you're not doing it yourself. It's coming from another place, but it's yourself
Oh.
because it's concealed.
it's okay. So you're saying it's not coming from yourself, it's coming from a cognitum within the person himself, but it's
Within
not
the
himself.
Gevura itself, within the darkness itself, I said, within the
Uh-huh.
Gevura itself, it
Mhm.
resides is embedded in a concealed way, the Helam Atzmi. I
Mhm.
think you need to go back and listen to the class of how Helam creates Helam, how the divine concealment creates the darkness of this world. Because what you're asking me is all around that. You're trying to apply revelation to this is a different track. How is there concealment? How could something be so dark in the first place that there's no godliness revealed at all? That itself is coming from God. Okay, so we'll stop here at the bottom